Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's dive into this, because today we're looking at some absolutely fascinating research sitting right at the bleeding edge of computer science and biology. We don't know AI is advancing at this crazy breakneck pace, right? But there's a massive looming bottleneck that, honestly, nobody really likes to talk about, and that is energy. To keep pushing the boundaries of what these large language models can do, we are consuming just staggering amounts of electricity. It's a critical problem, especially since we really want to move AI away from the cloud and directly onto our personal devices. Which brings us to this somewhat amusing but deeply profound question. Why on earth does an AI need a massive cooling tower and its own dedicated power grid while your brain, literally the most complex intelligence we know of, runs on a sandwich? Seriously, a human brain operates on about 20 watts of continuous power. That's roughly the equivalent of a dim light bulb. Meanwhile, training and running traditional large language models requires warehouse-sized data centers. This immense energy cost makes it incredibly difficult to deploy powerful private AI directly onto resource-constrained edge devices, like your smartphone or your smartwatch. If we want AI everywhere without absolutely melting our batteries, we need a major paradigm shift. So, Section 1, Brain-Inspired Computing, the Biological Blueprint. To find a solution to this energy crisis, researchers aren't just trying to build better batteries. Actually, they're looking in the mirror. They're looking at the biological blueprint. And this brings us to a super cool concept called neuromorphic computing. Put simply, this is a type of computing architecture heavily inspired by the actual biological structures and functions of the human brain. Instead of processing information in continuous, power-hungry streams like a traditional computer chip does, neuromorphic hardware utilizes discrete events, or spikes, to process data. It's a brilliant attempt to bring our silicon technology much, much closer to the extreme efficiency of carbon-based nature.
To really grasp this, let's contrast traditional artificial neural networks, ANNs, with biological-style spiking neural networks, or SNNs. Think of traditional AI like a dimmer switch that's just constantly drawing power. It's always performing these complex multiplications and continuous calculations across billions of parameters, whether it strictly needs to or not. On the other hand, an SNN is kind of like an event-driven motion sensor light. The neurons only fire or spike when there's enough accumulated input to actually trigger them. Plus, SNNs are incredibly efficient because they are entirely multiplication-free. They rely purely on simple accumulation. It's just a beautifully elegant, low-power way to process information.
Moving on to Section 2, the transformer bottleneck, hardware versus software.
Now, you might be wondering, if spiking neural networks are so remarkably efficient, why aren't we just using them right now for everything? Well, there's a big hardware mismatch. The current gold standard for natural language processing is the transformer architecture, the T in ChatGPT. But transformers are super math-heavy. They require highly complex mathematical operations. And neuromorphic hardware, by its very nature of being simple and spike-driven, literally cannot natively process things like division or square roots. This creates two massive bottlenecks when trying to run a language model. First, the softmax operation, which uses heavy exponential math to calculate attention probabilities. And second, layer normalization, which needs square roots for variance. SNNs basically just choke on these standard AI functions.
Enter Section 3, Meet Sorbet, the game-changing bridge. For a long time, this incompatibility seemed like a total dead end. That is, until a team from the National University of Singapore published a completely fascinating solution. Take a look here. On the left, we have the traditional architecture of a standard language model called BERT, packed full of those heavy mathematical functions. But on the right, you see the groundbreaking solution, the Sorbet model. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is if you look at those red bordered boxes, the researchers completely stripped out the mathematically heavy softmax and layer normalization functions and swapped them for brand new SNN-compatible alternatives called PD softmax and BSPN. We'll get into exactly how those work in just a second, but visually, you can clearly see how Sorbet maintains the overall shape of a transformer, but replaces the engine with one that can actually run on neuromorphic tracks. But the researchers didn't just stop at swapping out a few parts. To make absolutely sure Sorbet was as lean as possible for small edge devices, they used a technique called knowledge distillation. Essentially, they had a larger, smarter teacher model train a smaller student model to mimic its behavior. On top of that, they aggressively used model quantitation. They literally forced the model's weights down to just a 1-bit binary format. That means instead of storing complex decimal numbers for every single parameter, the model only stores ones and zeros. This makes Sorbet incredibly compressed and perfectly suited for ultra-low energy applications.
Which brings us to Section 4, Bit Shifting the Math, the clever cheat code. So, how exactly did they bypass all those heavy mathematical operations we talked about? The secret sauce behind those new components, PT softmax and BSPN, is a technique called bit shifting. Let me explain this with a quick analogy. In our standard base 10 number system, if you want to divide 500 by 10, you don't need to grab a calculator, right? You just shift the decimal point one place to the left to get 50. Well, computers operate in binary, which is base 2. So if a computer wants to multiply or divide by powers of 2, it doesn't need to run some complex energy-draining division algorithm. It just instantly shifts the binary bits to the left or right. Sorbet's core innovation is forcing the heavy math to approximate to the nearest power of 2, turning expensive division and exponential math into cheap, instant bit shifting. It is, quite literally, a mathematical cheat code. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why that cheat code matters so much. Look at the energy consumption here, measured in picojoules. At the top, standard softmax requires heavy division and exponential math, costing nearly 297 picojoules. But now, look right below it at Sorbet's PT softmax. By using bit shifting, the energy cost plummets to just under 11 picojoules. That's a massive drop. You can see a similarly huge reduction between standard layer normalization and Sorbet's BSPN. By sticking exclusively to add and shift operations, those yellow and green sections, the energy savings are absolutely staggering. Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into the final payoff, a greener AI future. Because, theoretical math is great and all, but does the language model actually still work after you compress it this much? Well, the researchers ran Sorbet through the GLUE benchmark. For those unfamiliar, GLUE is a standard suite of tests for natural language understanding. It tests things like sentiment analysis, question answering, and sentence similarity, and the results were incredibly promising. Despite being stripped down, converted to spikes, and limited to 1-bit binary weights, Sorbet maintains stable, highly competitive performance against traditional, power-hungry models of similar size. This serves as an amazing proof of concept for a massive dual benefit. We now know for sure that we don't have to completely sacrifice a model's natural language processing ability just to achieve extreme biological level efficiency. By carefully designing the model's architecture to work with the physical limitations of neuromorphic chips rather than fighting against them, we really get the best of both worlds. So the crucial point is captured in this staggering number right here, 27.16. When you combine the event-driven spiking neural network, the 1-bit weight quantization, and that brilliant bit-shifting math of PT softmax and BSPN, the Sorbet model requires 27.16 times less energy to run inference than a standard BERT model. Let that sink in for a second. That isn't just a marginal, incremental improvement, that is an entirely different category of energy efficiency. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. Right now, most of our AI lives up in the cloud. It costs millions of dollars in electricity and raises constant data privacy concerns. But research like Sorbet is paving the way for a totally different future. What happens when your smartphone, your watch, or even your household appliances can run powerful, entirely private language models locally, using neuromorphic chips that barely sip at their batteries? The marriage of biological efficiency and artificial intelligence is no longer just science fiction. The math is already here. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope you found this deep dive as fascinating as I did.